So thanks everybody for coming. My name is Mark Dempsey. I work with Living Web Farm some. I work for Carolina Farm Stewardship most of the time. The reason that I'm here going to be talking about small grain production is because I've spent part of my lifetime, sort of like a past career, working in small grain production, mostly for research. Up in Pennsylvania, up in the land of Pennsylvania. And then that was kind of like at big scales, you know, where like you're running regular sized farming equipment, big combines, big planters, so on and so forth. And then since coming down here, I've kind of been on a quest to be able to do this without the infrastructure that already existed, kind of like create this with the capital that I have. And so through that quest, I've been kind of learning how to do small scale stuff. So that means sort of like taking existing old school technologies, taking existing like new high tech stuff and trying to find a compromise there. And the portion that I'm going to be talking about is just like the production stuff. So literally just from seed to seed. So somebody else is we're going to have two other folks talking about what you need to do to go from seed to loaf. So all that processing and baking stuff. So just the farming side of things. Before we jump in, can we do a quick round of introductions? Just so I know who you are, why you're here, if you're a farmer, if you're a baker, if you're a miller, if you're a whatever, homesteader, anything. Go ahead.
My name is Tom. I'm here because I am a baker and I would love to learn about growing wheat.
Sure.
I'm Jason. I've always wanted to learn how to bake bread, so that was the big thing. So that's why I'm here.
I'm Rebecca, and I'm here to pretty much try and grow my own grain and hopefully do homesteading eventually.
Sure.
Chris, I'm just very interested in amateur gardening.
Cool.
I'm Lark, and I'm intrigued of all of the lists that you fired off. Maybe I'm an aspiring all of those things, and maybe not. I'll go figure out.
Sure. Okay, great. Well, let's just jump right in. So the grains that are grown for bread are just sort of like collectively called small grains. So that is all of these friends right here. So wheat, rye, oats, barley. I'm not sure if you would want to make bread out of barley, but all of those others are, you know, occasionally you're going to see put into bread as flour in one way or another. And then more recently, there's been a lot of interest in these ancient wheats, so-called ancient wheats, that are different wheat species, so einkorn, emmer, spelt, so on and so forth, that all kind of are basically like wheat, have the same problems from a production standpoint, maybe with different culinary or baking characteristics. Richer in flavor often, which is why people like them. So if that's kind of what we're talking about, we're going to spend most of the time thinking about wheat throughout all of this, if that's going to be the main ingredient in any of the bread that we're trying to bake. Let's think for just a moment about the scale that you're working at and what you're up against. So the extent to which you might want to think about mechanizing your operation. So there's a lot of like old school existing technology, we're talking scythes, you know, like hand threshing and stuff like that, that makes all of this accessible and totally doable. But you know, you eventually hit walls, you hit a ceiling. You can only be so efficient with the time that you put in with what you get out in terms of grain. And so I happen to be an advocate for mechanizing like however and wherever you can, despite like how awesome scythes and stuff are. But I did want to just point out that like if you think about the grain that you can harvest in an hour of work, depending on whether like you have absolutely no mechanization or maybe you're just working with like small hand tools to all the way up on like a combine and so forth, these guys are going to be super efficient by comparison, but I want you to just forget about them. Don't worry about them. You're never going to be them. If you had a tractor, you can do a heck of a lot with just a tractor, just because working soil requires a lot of horsepower and is very time intensive, and it's just you and a hoe or you and a shovel, so on and so forth. You know, maybe you have a scythe and maybe you have a good way to thresh out grain. Let's call that like, you know, some minimum technology there. You can get a lot done by comparison to just working with like small hand tools, for example. And all of these things are like fairly well developed. They've been around for how long? A very long time, and we did it that way for a while. Of course, you know, we do things much more efficiently now that requires a whole lot of extra energy input. So kind of depends on where you want to fall out, how much you value being able to like do things quickly versus like appreciating the process of walking through a field with a scythe, or maybe the community aspect of threshing grain with your friends because it's fun. just kind of depends on if you want to be commercial or if you're doing this as a hobby, that kind of thing. So meantime, forget about the big boys and just be thinking about where you want to fall out on that, how much, you know, it's worth to, how much time you want to invest, what it's worth to you. Okay, so I'm not going to go into like a ton of detail on the growing stuff. We're going to talk about that a good bit more in the field, so I'm just going to use this opportunity to cover some numbers because it's hard to remember numbers in my opinion if somebody just tells them to you. I don't know, I prefer to see them on a screen. So the 3 things that are important for planting is when you do it, the method that you do it, and then the seeding rate that you use. So in terms of date, you kind of have to strike this balance. You can be too early. You might be like ripping and roaring trying to get your crop in because you're excited about that crop of wheat next summer. So you might want to put it in early, but you can run into problems. So there's a fly that lays its eggs if you plant too early, and then come spring, they're going to be chewed on your wheat. It's the Hessian fly, so you have to try to like avoid that by planting a little bit later. Also, powdery mildew, if planted early, can be a problem. And then you can also get aphids, which transmit this virus called barley yellow dwarf virus, which is like, can be pretty devastating. So by avoiding aphids, you usually avoid the virus. And then Hessian fly is your other big boy. But if you plant too late, so, okay, I'm going to delay planting because I don't want to avoid these things. Sure, great, we can all do that. But planting too late then is the next issue because it gets too cold for it to put on much growth in the fall. And the more growth that it puts on in the fall, the more it's going to like, boom, come alive in the spring. And so tillering, is anybody familiar with that term of tillering? Grasses do this, right? So if you plant a seed of wheat, it puts out one little leaf first, and then it starts putting out little side shoots, and that's called tillering, which is, it just is what it is. So you get less of that growth in the fall, you get less tillering, lower yields as a result. Pretty straightforward. I'll also mention that fall weather has a lot to do with the yields that you're going to get. We'll talk about this out in the field because we had a pretty rough, I don't know if anybody remembers last fall/winter, but it was pretty rough. It was dry for many, many months. We didn't get like a drop of rain out in this field, so we irrigated and had like, you know, moderate success with this particular field in this particular year. Just something to be aware of, and we'll kind of address those issues out in the field. Okay, so where do y'all live? Everybody around here? Yep, pretty much. Okay, so let's just say that we're over here. If we're thinking about when we want to do this, we're talking end of September, first week of October, something like that is an ideal. Of course, that's like ideal on average. Kind of depends on the year. If you're gonna have a warm fall after you plant, then you can get away with planting a little bit later. If it's, you know, you expect it to be cold, then you want to go on the early side. Of course, we can't really predict that in the long term, so we use averages as a way to target that. You kind of want to try to fit this into your crop rotation, assuming that you have one if you're going to be gardening or small farming or whatever, so that your crop is coming out with enough time to prepare a seed bed and put down fertility and get this in by the first week of October. So that often is challenging, you know, like if you're growing a late, long season crop, it's not ready to go, what are you going to do? There's a few ways that you might be able to get around with that, but for the most part, just be planning ahead. It's the way to go. Okay, seeding methods. Equally as important because establishment is where it's all at. So easiest thing to do is broadcasting, right? So this might be one of these chest-mounted spinner spreaders. It could be a tractor-mounted spinner spreader. However, these things are super weather dependent. So you could put all this seed out, you could put out 200 pounds of this on a small area and get nothing to germinate because the weather just isn't working out for you. And so it's gonna almost always be best if you can put this directly in the ground. So there's a lot of technology around this. You might use an earthway seeder. We'll see this little push no-till seeder out there later today. Maybe you have a small tractor and you rig up something with some jang or whatever kind of seeders, gang them up. Or maybe you have a drill. I don't think any of us have drills, but this is the ideal. And we'll see one of these out in the field too. If you don't have this kind of stuff, try to go for something like this. Just a cheapo earthway seeder. Or maybe you want to go with a fancier one. It doesn't, I mean, whatever. That's not important which brand or type, but do be careful about using these. You can have success with these, just totally depends on the weather. I will also mention that there are ways that you can make these work by like putting out your seed in a standing cover crop, chopping that cover crop down to kind of like form a little mulch, just to conserve moisture, gets things to jump a little bit better. Better success with that, but I would recommend putting it in the ground if you can. Okay, so just a quick table on what your planting rate is. So generally, the recommendation for, particularly for like organic growing, is going to be 1 to 1.5 million seeds to the acre. Depending on like how much your seeds weigh, people often convert that to pounds per acre. So, you know, depending if you've got an average of 15,000 seeds to the pound, then, you know, you're planting at, 100 pounds to the acre, something like that. You can easily convert that to seeds per square foot by dividing by 43,560. And then you can kind of like figure out your row spacing and distance between seeds, if that mattered to you. So like, let's just say you want to do 6-inch rows. Like that drill that you saw in this one does 7.5-inch rows. If you wanted it a little bit tighter for like keeping the weeds back, 6 inches is a good number to work with. I mean, whatever, it's not hugely important. Then, you know, you can divide that number by 43,560 and just do the math on how many seeds you need per foot of row, that kind of thing. And then you can put in a different seed plate in your planter to figure out about how you need to do that, adjust the gear ratio, whatever it is. I will mention that I put these down here, these lower numbers, because that's what people seem to be talking about for planting these ancient wheats. So if you're interested in einkorn, if you're interested in emmer or spelt, people usually talk about planting them at lower rates, maybe half of this recommended amount. I mean, some people say even less. There's not a lot of good information out there on like what you ought to do. So just be aware. You might need to drop it way down if you're working with like some heirloom, kind of like not super well bred varieties. As the season gets later and you know that tillering is going to be limited as you go into the fall, plant more. Pretty straightforward. Just getting more basically seed heads coming up in the spring. That's the idea. Okay, so again, I'm keeping this super basic. Soil fertility stuff, we're just talking about like, please expect to need to put something out. So, oops, sorry. Depending on, I mean, what you put out is dependent upon your yield goal. So like, these numbers right here are based on 65 bushels to the acre, and you can do the math to convert that to what you think you want, but that's a pretty good yield for this area of North Carolina, maybe like higher than you might expect. So NPK would be, 70 pounds of nitrogen, 45 of phosphorus, and 135 of potassium. And you can back calculate that to whatever suits you in your smaller area. That's per acre. Definitely note that it requires a lot of potassium. Anybody here planning to use sort of like synthetic fertilizers versus organic ones? Not hugely important which way you go, but do be aware that if you're using organic fertility sources like manure and things like that, they're low in potassium relative to phosphorus especially. So you might end up with like a lot of extra phosphorus and then a potential pollution problem and not enough potassium. So just be aware, you might have to add a synthetic potassium or a natural one that's like a mined mineral that is super concentrated. So this potassium amount is about what vegetables require, which is really high compared to other grains. There just seems to be something about getting through the winter that makes them need that. Lime if you need it, keep your pH just below neutral. And if you're trying to do a really good job, apply spring nitrogen at green up. So that's when it kind of like comes out of dormancy, breaks dormancy, starts its growth. Lay down, whatever amount of this total you didn't put down in the fall, that kind of thing. So this is generally, by the way, pre-plant fertility that you're putting out. Okay, so let's talk about, just for a quick second, when you're gonna wanna harvest this stuff, because that's like, timing is pretty critical. So let's think about how these plants grow. It's important to be able to identify their growth stage when you're out there so that you know like, okay, this is like way too young or this is super mature and I need to be worried about losing quality. So when they first start out, again, remember tillering is when they're putting out the little side shoots. They start to grow up in the spring. The last leaf that pops out is called the flag leaf. It forms this boot looking thing that the grain head is in. So this is called the boot stage when the grain head's right there. Then it comes out. It's hanging out of that top leaf. It puts its flowers out, and then they do their thing. They pollinate, and the grain starts to fill in. And it starts out as like, once it starts to fill in, if you can like break it off of the head and squish it, it comes out as this like sort of milky grain stuff. So it's called the milk stage. And then as that starts to kind of get converted from sugary, watery stuff into more starchy stuff, it they call it the dough stage. So it goes from milk to dough, and you can feel this just by pinching it. It's either going to juice out a little bit of milk, or it's going to be, like just soft as you squish it with your thumbnail, and eventually it hardens up and matures. And that's when you're going to be wanting to harvest this for bread quality stuff, is once it's hard, kind of like in the hard dough stage, but not super hard and brittle. And assuming also that it will eventually get drier than that, you want to maintain quality. When it gets threshed out, you might break seeds in half and reduce quality. Just lower quality stuff the longer you wait. And then disease often comes in, especially in this area. This time of year, it's wet a lot of the time. Like this, we've had this every afternoon for the last little while, so it's hard to find a dry period. The longer you leave it out there, the more likely you are to have it get some funk on it, and getting that funk is actually a very serious concern. Is anybody here familiar with alpha toxins that come with this? Something you want to be very careful about. It's very acutely toxic to your liver from this Fusarium fungal species, and it's bad news bears. You can't cook it out. When you see that funky head, you want to always avoid it. And the longer you leave it in there, the more likely it is to happen. Just as a heads up, something to look for, you see a funky head and you can kind of pull it apart and the seed has pink on it. That pink is indicative of that Fusarium causing trouble. And you want to just totally avoid that. You don't want to hurt anybody or yourself with alpha toxins. The other thing that happens to the quality is it starts to germinate just a little bit, and then it might dry down and it stops this germination process, gets wet again, and this reduces the quality and changes the flavor profile and all that fun stuff. So just be careful of it. Get it out as soon as you can. It's easy to get out of the field when it's a little bit wet but it doesn't store well. So you want to also be striking that balance of storability or being prepared to dry it if it's not super dry, if you're worried about quality. So again, hard dough, balanced timing between early and late. Basically focusing on quality and not getting toxins in there. Methods. You know what? We're going to talk about methods in the field. So hopefully this rain will pass. Pat's going to be back here any minute to talk about making starters and so forth. So that's it for now.
And so there's 3 parts to making bread. The first part's making the dough. That's what I'm going to demo now. Later on we'll look at the proofing of it and the baking of it. And the dough is for sure the most critical piece. And yet, if you blow the other pieces, it doesn't matter how good the dough was. And you can make not that great a dough, proof it really well, and bake it really well. It can still be a darn good loaf. So every piece is important. Second part is the proofing, which is the word we use. Raising it is what you say at home, but it's the only baking jargon I use, as far as I know, is proofing. But it's basically just raising your bread. And that's very important. There's different stages. It gets an initial fermentation and proof after you make the dough usually, and then sometimes a second one. And in that time, with some breads, you may be folding them to build strength. I would definitely not do that with this focaccia because I wouldn't be able to stretch it out. I developed the gluten so much it would never stretch out. But I might very well do it with some other bread if I was trying to get power to it. It's really the most folding I've ever seen is for ciabatta, which is so wet you can't knead it. So you get it to be strong dough by folding it. And so that's the next part. The hardest part of this is not those first 1 or 2 proofs where you're just basically letting it double in bulk. It's not even that important that you check that. If you learn to check it, you can get the maximum amount of proof out of it. That helps a little bit, but it doesn't really matter if you get that. But the critical one is when does it go in the oven? That's so critical. You can put it in way sooner than you need to. And if you have a really great oven with a lot of steam in there, you might get away with it. If you slashed it really well, it might rise so much in the oven that you won't notice that you put it in way too early. But oftentimes, if you ever made a loaf and there's a weird place that it blew out the side or the top did some kind of weird split, that's because you put it in way before it was ready and it just kept rising in the oven, had nowhere to go, and busted out somewhere in the bread. I'll show you. It's actually a very easy way to check that. But it is the most delicate part as far as, if you were not paying attention and were to slam it somehow, you can make it fall. Early on when making the dough, you are doing a similar test of how developed the gluten is or how much it's relaxed. And early on, you hit it pretty hard and see how fast it comes back. When you're testing it before you bake it, moisten your finger and just gently put a little indentation and then watch how it moves or doesn't move. And it's not that hard to do once you learn to do it. But the problem with that too, I think you'll agree with that, Tom, is every bread is different. Some breads want to proof a little longer, and you just have to learn that as you do it. You can't really be taught that. A good way to learn it. Usually, most recipes call for 2 loaves. Make one that you plan on proofing. Make them both at the same time, but proof one a little longer. Proof one. Put one in right when you think it should go in, and let the other one go in a little later. And then you'll see, did it fall, or could it have actually gone a little further and you got more rise out of it? And that's a great way to teach yourself. It shouldn't be that different if you wait like 10 minutes or something. But sometimes it might. Depends on how well you're able to tell when it's supposed to go in. So any one of these stages can negate the next stage. So you want to try and hit them all, but don't give up. If you just couldn't get that dough like you wanted it and you don't have time to let it develop anymore, aim to proof the heck out of it and bake the heck out of it. It might still be a really good loaf. Like I said, in the baking, you may not have time to wait for it to proof completely. The guests are going to be there. It's close enough, then you would slash it more deeply and give it even more steam and allow it to rise more in the oven. You can do that kind of stuff, and it kind of works, All breads are the result of conditioning the dough, And if you go to the store, you'll see those, ingredient lists, and they're about, on the average bread, if it's not a artisan bread, even some of the artisan breads, they're pretty long, and the last few lines have a lot of dye and methyl, this and that in there. And if you haven't taken chemistry, you probably know what they are. I don't know what they are. But I've studied bread baking enough to know that a lot of them are dough conditioners. And they may be feeding the yeast, they may be allowing the gluten to extend more, they may be getting the dough to last longer. There's all kinds of different ways that are, hold more moisture in the dough. All kinds of different ways that those dough conditioners that have those weird long names with the dyes and the methyls and all that they do that kind of stuff. You can accomplish all that with natural ingredients. I'm not going to try and teach you what each one will do now, but I'll just list some and tell you that most of the ones that I bother to use, what they do is they provide more nutrition for the yeast, or more varied nutrition, so the yeast is even better at fermenting. They aid the fermentation. They help the gluten to relax sometimes, and they hold moisture in the dough. Those are the big things that I tend to get from dough conditioners, But actually, some of them help the bread to rise, not just because they help the gluten, but for other reasons. Besides the combination of helping the fermentation to go better and the gluten to be more extendable is a big reason why dough rises better. But there's other factors we don't have time to go into that are also affected by these pretty common ingredients that are dough conditioners. Things like potatoes, cooked grains, some herbs, a bunch of fresh herbs or even dried herbs, because they have things like vitamin C in them, which is actually a dough conditioner, can actually help to make a dough rise better. At the Muffin Man Bakery that both Tom and I worked at, we had a basic dough that was then turned into all these different kind of breads, and the herb bread was always the biggest and lightest, and it was because of those herbs. They were providing food for the yeast and ascorbic acid and getting it to work really well. The other dough conditioners are the ones we all know, right? We wouldn't have bread without salt. It is probably the critical dough conditioner if you don't consider yeast a dough conditioner, which some people might, But if you don't consider leavening the dough conditioner, then salt is the most important dough conditioner. And then there are dough conditioning processes: kneading, folding, long, slow, cold fermentation. All those things are conditioning the dough to make it work better, give you more flavor, last longer, do all the things that long list of ingredients. The reason why it's a bunch of chemicals is they don't have to use more expensive things, and they don't have to spend any time on it. They just got a package, they throw it in there, just did all the things that you had to spend making your dough conditioners or doing these processes. They accomplish with a package full of stuff, and we see the result. It's not too exciting. So the thing that makes bread work, and the thing that I'm sure drives people doing gluten-free baking nuts, is the elasticity and the ability of gluten, right, which is a complex of proteins, to first develop into long strands, and then as you do things to condition it, either kneading or giving it time, or fermenting, whatever, it actually develops sheets. of protein that are extendable and flexible. And then when the dough is sitting there fermenting, because you've given it flour, water, and yeast at least, maybe sweetener, maybe not, that's food for the yeast. The yeast, its metabolic byprocesses, right, is, among other things, to make carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is captured in the little bubbles that are created by this, like these extensions or cells that are, not maybe bubbles, but cells that are created by these sheaths of gluten. And so why the artisan bread has the big holes is they make sure to put that bread in a very hot oven on a floor that is very thick and has an endless supply of intense heat. And then that intense heat makes all those little cells with carbon dioxide in them get way big, because gas expands with heat. And that's how you get that big rise that happens from hearth baking, the kind of baking we're going to do out here in this oven. And it's why you get the big holes, because of the gluten going up. The gluten cells just expanding incredibly with the carbon dioxide in them. So that's the kind of thing you're trying to accomplish. Why it's hard to get whole wheat bread to work as well, and we're going to be mostly doing whole wheat bread today because we grew it. Mark mostly grew it. I watered it, he planted it. Mark processed it, and threshed it. Spent a lot of time on this little project, and then we ground it, and we didn't have the system to bolt it, to separate out the bran and the gluten. And there's a big plus for us as far as nutrition and flavor. Texture's not quite the same. It's not as light. Part of why it's not as light is the bran is actually sharp. And on a microscopic level, it slices up the gluten. The gluten is critical in what you choose to do, how much gluten you choose to use. When I first started baking, I always wanted the highest gluten flour I could get, because that's what made it rise. And it really mattered to me. The longer I baked, the more I learned that the breads we all envied and wanted to emulate, those European breads, they don't have as good a growing conditions there, so they don't have as much gluten. They don't have the Dakotas. They don't have that kind of place with the ideal kind of deep cold winter that lets that stuff develop incredibly, and then the long hot summer days, they just don't have it, so they don't have as much gluten. And indeed, some of the aspects of bread, some of that really nice scoring and all that is actually easier to get to work the way you want it to if you're using not so much gluten. So I actually now use more pastry flour than I used to. Still use some unbleached, but it's more of a combination, and all-purpose flour will work pretty well too. I used to think you just couldn't get a rise without it, but the longer you learn how to work the dough, it's not hard to develop a gluten in anything enough to rise well, if you can then proof well and bake well. So those are the other pieces of that. The key ingredient, the number one ingredient, the one you want to care the most about, and the one that's the center of this event today, is the flour. That is, if you have all the skill in the world and you're using crappy flour, you might get a decent loaf of bread, but it won't be as spectacular as it could be since you had everything else right, because the flour is failing you. So you want to get really good flour. Jen Lapidus is going to join us, has Carolina Ground. That's one that's dedicated to local heirloom flour. It's really a great mill. Somebody that she learned from and worked with, Lindley Mills, has been around for a long time and makes wonderful flour also. A lot of people, because they go to the grocery store to get their flour, buy King Arthur, and it's the best flour in the grocery store, there's no doubt about it. The organic King Arthur comes from Lindley Mills. So you can actually go directly to Lindley Mills and not pay the King Arthur price. And it's really good flour. I encourage you to try both the Carolina Ground and the Lindley Mills. They're both wonderful flours, and you get to work with the differences. They're all different. Each one will make a different loaf of bread, but they're all really pretty darn fresh. And by the way, interestingly enough, when I talked to the librarian at the Bakery Institute, I couldn't afford to join the Bakery Institute, but the librarian was bored and would talk. When he found out that I was using fresh flour, he said it's not possible to make good bread with fresh flour. You have to oxidize it. You have to actually get it to basically change so it's more stable and actually way less healthy for you. And that's how the professional bakers who want machines to be able to do it and not have to do any, the machines can't think. So they want something that's so stable that they can count on it to work every time. And we don't have to do that. We can get way more quality because we don't do that. And way more nutrition too. Okay, and speaking of nutrition, The fermentation, you might think the nutrition is all about the flour. And by the way, things to avoid in flour is not only, bromated flour, actually very bad for us. You want to avoid that. You want to avoid any kind of flour that's artificially bleached. It's okay to use white flour, but just because the ingredients are bolted out, not because they then hit it with something to make it even more white and more stable. You don't want to use that. Don't use old flour. Just let it go. Do you garden? If you garden, flour is a great fertilizer. You got at least 9% gluten, which is probably directly convertible to nitrogen or darn close. It's super fine. You can just use it as a fast fertilizer. You won't have to waste it. The other thing to watch out for with flour, if it's whole wheat and stuff, it can go rancid. And the way you don't even want to think about keeping whole wheat flour if you're not going to refrigerate it or freeze it for more than a month, I would say. Do you think it's okay to keep it for a month, Tom? Yeah, not in the summer. You're right. Unless you air condition. See, I air condition. Not so much because I want to be cool, because I don't want to get moldy. But if you don't air condition, probably not. Probably just a week or two. You want to just buy small amounts and use it up. If you have any doubt, taste it. You're not going to enjoy the taste no matter what. But if the finish is bitter, it's rancid. It's actually bad for you. It's not going to make a good tasting loaf. Put it on your garden. And of course, you want to avoid bugs or any other contaminants. And I also recommend keeping it in a very tightly sealed container, not a plastic bag. It's incredibly easy to have grain moths, and they'll tear up all that stuff, cost you a lot of money, and be a real bother. They can chew through a plastic bag in a second. They can't chew through a plastic bucket or a glass jar. So I recommend you keep your flour that way. Ideally, if you have the space, keep the whole wheat in the fridge or the freezer. It's going to last you a long, long time and be way fresh that way. You might, as you're learning how to do it, want to take it out and let it warm up so you're not thrown off by the temperature. There's ways to adjust that. It's just plain. If you feel like your flour's cold, just warm your water up more, and that'll solve that problem. Or here in North Carolina, actually right here, the standard that both I think Lindley Mills and Jen aim for is at least 12% protein, or protein just about equals gluten. If you see that, you have a bread flour. If it's below that, it's more like 9, then it's a pastry flour. If it's kind of in between that, it's probably an unbleached flour. Any one of them can make a decent bread. You just have to develop the skills for it. In this class, this class won't really give you every skill you need, but we'll give you a start. And then we have at least, I think, 2 videos on making bread online too. We got the flour kind of covered. We're going to show the making of the dough. We're not going to talk about that. We'll just show it. A lot of us like to use starters rather than quote sourdough starters, though they don't have to be sour, rather than yeast. We're actually today, I planned on using nothing but the starter I captured from the grain that we grew, but we got the grain late enough, and it gave me a false read. It started off super active, but now it's slowed down. I don't trust it, and I was kind of torn because I wanted to make this bread I really love called Farmer's French, which is a combination of yeast and starter, and it's really a wonderful bread. I'll talk to you about how sourdough starter is actually a dough conditioner too. You can actually use it not to raise the bread, but for other conditioning things. And that's how I use this starter in this bread. I don't know that's how it was intended in the original recipe. That's how I've developed it. And it used to be for a long time that using yeast was just looked down on. Once people learned that they can make, it's kind of empowering and wonderful to be able to make your own starter, to capture it off of something. One example I have is I'm just starting to get it going. I got it from peach leaves, or from the grain that we grew. It's kind of fun. So people do that, and then all of a sudden, like, oh, yeast is bad. So you're not a good baker if you use yeast. You're not an artisan baker. But then Tom showed me a book. What's the name of that guy again?
Chad Robertson, Tartine.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, he actually rediscovered a tradition, which is to combine the yeast and the sourdough and get the positive impacts of both. And that's what we're going to play with today. Had we had a more powerful starter, I might have chosen a different bread. But this one's actually easier to accomplish and go off and teach grain and all that stuff if the weather lets us. So we're going to do that one. But you might want to make a starter. If you want to make a starter, there's just some basic things to learn, really simple things. And the number one thing is start off with really tiny amounts. Because until you've actually captured that, whatever you use to capture the starter, it could simply be the grain, right? To capture the microorganisms you want, but it might be something like a peach leaf or some hops, or a grape is a classic, right? The average organic grape, that white bloom on there, that's the organisms that are going to start bread. It's also what starts wine, You know, it's all pretty easy. But when you first put it in the conditions where it can grow, it's just waking up and getting going and getting used to it. And if you go ahead and make a whole lot of that, it's basically junk. You know? And in order to feed that well and keep it going, you got to add more than you started with. So start with a really small amount when you're capturing it. Because of the difficulty of grinding the grain and stuff, when I first made the starters that I'm going to show you in a couple minutes, they were like a tablespoon at the most, each one. Because it took me hours to get that much flour trying to clean it up by hand, you know? And that was fine. That's all you need. All you got to do is wake up that community and get them to invigorate. They multiply exponentially once you wake them up. So don't go making tons of starter until you see that you have gotten it where it'll double in volume within an hour or two. Once it'll double in volume within an hour or two, then it's ready to use. Then you can decide how much you need for the bake, look at when you're going to bake, and divide the flour you need to make that much, right, by how many times you think you can feed it in that time. The more times you can feed it or renew it, the stronger your starter. You know? But don't end up, you know, most people who figured out that they want to feed their starter a lot, I call keeping it young, still make the mistake of making so much because they always got taught to do that. Every time you feed your starter, it's a cup of flour. Don't do that, or you've got to start a chain letter to get rid of it. You know? Which has happened. I guess that doesn't happen anymore, but there used to be the chain letters that come around. They would, you know, say, I'm sending you this starter, and you can do this, this, and that with it. And it's just a way to get rid of excess starter. And you don't need to do that if you start off small. So it's a pretty simple principle, and a simple recipe. You can do any number of water-flour combinations. One that works great for me is 1/4 cup of water, 1/3 cup of flour. You know, and then actually until it gets going, I probably wouldn't even use all that. That's just because it's easier to mix that much and keep track of it. I probably would use some of that in a pancake or something, or you know, put it in the compost or something. I'd probably take like a teaspoon from that and add it back to the same thing. 1/3 cup of water, 1/4 cup of water, 1/3 cup of flour. Until I saw activity, you know, until I saw activity that was actually moving towards at least doubling within a few hours. You know, once it does that, then I'm willing to start letting it get bigger because I can start making enough to bake with. But until it can do that, don't make tons of starter. It's just, you're going to have to find some use for it, and it won't be good for bread. The key things are feed it as much as you can prior to using it. Don't let it get old. If you don't feed it, what'll happen is the first organisms that thrive are the ones that thrive on starches, and that's what you want, because you don't want organisms that eat protein, because that's the structure of the bread. You know, so you don't want that to happen. So if you let it go too long without feeding it, the starch ones run out of food, and they get suppressed by the protein eaters, and all of a sudden you got a starter that's out of control. It'll give you a flat, very sour dough. You know, so you just don't want to go there. A good trick to make sure your starters don't go there is when you do feed it, save your potato water and your pasta water and feed your starters with those. Use either rye, which is low gluten, so it's more starches, or pastry flour to feed them, right? Don't use high protein flour because you're just tempting it. Oh, let me introduce Jennifer, Jen Lapidus. She's the owner and operator of the Caroline Brown Mill and the former owner and operator of one of the best bakeries we've had around here, which is the Stonebridge Bakery. Natural Bridge, I'm sorry, thank you. It was made out of stone though, wasn't that Natural Bridge?
It's been a long time.
It has, indeed. Anyways, I'm just talking about starters right now. I'm saying that it's good to feed your starters with the low protein starter. And then basically try to figure out a routine where you can keep it young. You know, that formula I gave, if you're going to be at work, but you still need it to be working, you might make it thicker. Put more flour in it so it doesn't work so fast, you know. You want to get home and have big bubbles and have it having risen and not dropped. You know, if you can feed it at that stage, way more powerful than if it's crashed. You know, and if it's separated and there's water on top, it's got an alcoholic smell and stuff, just start over again. You know, don't try and make bread with that. Don't try and feed it with that. It's not going to give you. If you're only relying on a natural leavening, right? Not yeast, like sourdough leavening. Don't use an old starter. Don't think, even if you can bring it back, you'll bring it back and it'll look kind of good, but it won't have the power you want for a great bread. Dr. Elaine Ingham, my favorite soil ecologist, she bakes some, and because she loves the fact that everything is covered with microbes, and those microbes are beneficial always, and basically most plants have yeast on them. It's part of what occupies that leaf, and who knows, the many things it does for the plant, we don't know, but one thing it does for sure is take up space so that pathogens can't land on that leaf. And so she'll just walk out into the garden and get a different leaf for every time she bakes. I never would have thought it, but Tom made one with, was it cabbage or broccoli leaves, or?
Yeah, red cabbage.
Red cabbage leaves. Everything we learn in gardening, right, is that they're not fungal, you know? And yet on the leaves they are. One of the most powerful starters I've ever seen, you know? Another starter that's real fun to make is if you can find wild persimmons in the fall, you can smell the yeast. And it'll just kick into a crank and starter. And sometimes it may take a long time to finish fermentation, but boy, it makes this wonderful golden crest. Wonderful flavor. Really a fun thing to make a starter with. So play with that, you know.
Just one little thing is just that, to me, what's so amazing about wheat is that it comes equipped to become a leavened bread. That you know, what occurs naturally on the wheat berry. That's, you know, the days of culture out of flour itself is what, you know, we developed our culture from, and it's that perfect, and it's amazing to me how far we've come from that. You know, that like it came equipped to make bread.
Yep.
And you know, we didn't need the packets from the store, or even going out to the garden. We could just work with the wheat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely, and indeed, that's what. Unfortunately, you missed it, but I remember I told you how active it was already. Fooled me. It then kind of slowed down. Maybe because I had to put it in the fridge because we didn't have the flour, and now I'm going to actually make a bread that has both starter and yeast in it. But of course, it did take right off, and I know they will be. You know, in fact, the ones that I've made since I started the doughs are getting more active. You know, and yeah, definitely, making daysum is a lot of fun. If you want a description on how to do it that works very well, that takes a lot of flour, Laurel's bread book has a real fun description. I've made that, and it's kind of fun to look at too because you're putting this small ball, you know, of flour and water that you've kind of kneaded a little bit into this large amount of the exact same flour, and it should be very fresh flour. And when it starts to work, you kind of see how volcanoes happen, you know, how mountains rise, because you just see the flour like rising, and the more you do it, the more it rises and stuff. It's pretty fun to make, and I've made it twice, and each time it was one of the strongest starters I've ever had.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, our whole bakery was based on days of culture, and it forms a rind, so you're eventually, you know, peeling away the rind and getting that and dissolving it in water, making another stiff dough ball, so it exists within these parameters of low moisture, cool temperatures, narrowing the scope of microbials that, you know, are going to be, supposedly, it's the microbials that exist on the wheat berry itself that enables it, I guess that breaks it down, enables it to germinate in the field, or at least I feels like, at least that's the myth that we...
Yeah. No, I think that's probably true, and I think why, I don't know if you did it, but why Laurel had you put it in the flour is you're assuring that you keep just those microbes.
Yeah, you're surrounded by it. It's not, you're not trying to capture yeast from the air. You know, our temperatures were cool, 55, 60 degrees.
Mm-hmm. That is, if you can, the cooler, all fermentation, the slower and cooler you can do it, the better it is. You know, if you can give it time and let it be cool, it makes better bread. Sometimes our lives don't fit into that, but you know, it definitely works, and for sure that would do it. And indeed, the fact that you were using the low moisture cool means that you can help control it changing and going someplace else. You know, any opportunistic yeast that gets in there is not going to be able to really multiply because it's already got this big population and the conditions aren't right for somebody else to get started. You know, so it's actually, people are awful smart sometimes at some things anyways, you know. They figured out bread really well. And yeah, they've gone around and back and forth in a lot of different ways, yeah. It is fun to play with the other things though and see what they'll do. And they do make different breads, you know. It's quite interesting to catch the different, you know, that's, you know, it's fun. Tom can tell you, if there was a society for the prevention of cruelty to starters, I would be like on its top 10 most wanted list,
I used to keep 4 or 5 different cultures in my bakery because we started with the Daison, which is 100% whole wheat. Then I cracked rye culture, which is such an interesting smell. And like if I had extra of it, I'd leave it out just because the smell was so lovely, and nothing was sour or vinegar. It was just floral. And then a rye flour culture, kamut culture, a spelt culture, and they were all distinctly different, you know. And even if you cut it off of something else, it becomes what it's going to be. But that note of the different grain, it's so interesting.
Yeah, the shame of this is I made a spelt starter, and it worked. It was one of the 2 that I made, but we ran out of spelt flour, so I eventually had to, because half the spelt flour is too wet to work. So it's very interesting. Each grain will make even a different one. Everything is different. Everything will make a different starter. So just play with that. It's a lot of fun, and remember, keep it young. If you're going to store it in the fridge, feed it before you put it in the fridge. Always feed it whenever you can feed it if you're going to be storing it, or if you're trying to build it to a time where you can bake. You don't want the starters to run out of food, because if they do, it's selecting for the microorganisms that you don't want. There's other microorganisms that will take over, and they don't do what you want to do. They'll start eating the protein. They'll mess things up. So keep it young. That's the critical piece. A little bit talk about dough conditioning processes. I've talked a little bit about the things that condition doughs. Well, when you knead, that's a dough conditioning process. There's also a process, probably brought back into light. I don't think he really developed it. I'd be surprised, but maybe he did. But Professor Cavell in France came up with a concept called autolyzing. And all it is, and it doesn't really work as well, though it kind of works even for that. But it doesn't work as well with sponges, because sponges require that you put a fermentative agent in them. But basically, autolyzing is simply making your dough, and I recommend never putting all the flour called for in, because you're going to find out it's usually too much. But someplace within maybe 75% of all the flour, or 80%, and giving it as many good stirs as you want with a spoon till it comes into a really very loose, not at all formed dough, or even thick batter, and just walking away for 20 minutes to a half an hour. And literally, the gluten will start to form itself. As long as it doesn't have salt, which tightens it and inhibits the ability for it to do that, or acid of some form, like a sourdough starter would be high in acid, which will slow that process down. It doesn't really stop that process, by the way, as Jen can testify, because you never kneaded your bread at all, right?
Right. I'd mix it, but it wasn't like knead.
Right. Yeah. You just let the dough naturally develop. You gave it time. And another thing that I've learned, if you are making the kind of breads where you do want to knead them to a place, if you are home and you have the time to come back to it every once in a while, you might knead it for like a total of half a minute. But you just do a teeny bit, walk away, let it develop, come back. Once it's relaxed, once you can push on it and it doesn't spring back quickly, give it another quick knead, walk away and give it that time. And all the rest of the kneading is done by that time, by it developing itself. So you don't, I'm going to quickly show you how to have a pretty good kneading technique, but I barely use it because I'm using. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, when I'd have like something happen where I needed to speed things up, I would choose a smaller container to, maybe knead it some to kind of get things going, and put the dough in a smaller container, because then it has, it's going to create its own heat, and the pressure of that smaller container is going to, it just jump starts the fermentation, and the action that's occurring.
That's a trick I didn't know.
Yeah, because it happens from like the bottom up. So then my thinking is there's less room there, and then it's, I don't know, but it always seemed to work.
Pressure speeds it up. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
When you're actually in the bakery trying to do production, you come up with all these kind of tricks just so you can make it through the night. Kneading, I'm going to demonstrate. The other one that is really a powerful tool is folding. Really, a lot of the American older bakery books talked about punching your dough down, and that does have a positive impact. But if you can fold it, which isn't much more work, you're actually making the gluten even stronger. One time I had company come over, I was making pizza, and I got carried away with folding. I just liked it. I couldn't work the dough for pizza. It was terrible pizza because I made it so strong, it just didn't have time to relax. You know, where folding is used a whole lot is with super, like I said earlier, super wet doughs that are hard to knead at all. So then you simply fold them, and if you do a bunch of folds, ciabatta being a famous one for that, you get the same kind of gluten development. If you're going to count on just kneading and not use time to develop your gluten all the way, or even if you use time, when you know it's ready, is by how quickly it comes back. Though actually, if you give it all that time, you don't get to see that because it's relaxing while it's also building gluten. But if you're kneading anyways, the moment you stop kneading, you just kind of whack it with your fingers very quickly and you don't have to go way deep or anything. And if you've got it right, it'll have come back before you can even think about it. It'll bounce back. Then you know it's ready for sure. You don't actually have to get there if you're close and then give it time. It'll get there on its own. And then when you do the fold and stuff, you'll notice that after you folded it, it's there. It's got that quick comeback. But that if it's not anywhere near coming back quickly, then you have to do something to develop the gluten more. Either give it more time and give it folds or whatever, but something, or you won't have enough developed gluten. You're going to want to shape the loaf, and if you shape it right, it actually helps it to hold its structure and rise better, especially for the hearth breads that aren't contained in a loaf pan. You know, I mean, I'll give you a quick demonstration of that, I guess, but I'm not going to have you try to do it. And you just have to believe me to try and pick up the principle and remember the principle and then do it yourself at home. And you just have to practice it. And it seems impossible, and then all of a sudden you've got it. And once you've got it, you don't forget it, you know. So you just play with it, you know. And I'll describe what that is when we get to that stage. So I already mentioned it, but the fermentation process is next, the proofing of it, you know, letting it raise. There's the original bulk fermentation. You might do a second bulk fermentation. This is critical. I mean, it's critical. I mean, you can cheat. By the way, rapid rise yeast has no place in any real baker's house. You know, do you agree with that?
Ironically, yes, except for the fact that I bought some yesterday. I had some new, just cut soft wheat, and I want to make challah. So I was like, it's just, I don't know. I wanted
Not
to taste,
instant, but the rapid rise.
no, like I was like, well, I don't know. Actually, maybe I didn't buy that one. I was like, I hadn't bought yeast in 25 years, so I was like,
You probably just bought instant.
the one that had other ingredients in it, I didn't buy. It just said yeast, but one of them had like extra ingredients, which seemed really odd. I probably just bought yeast.
Rapid rise has been bred. It will not work at cold temperature. It has to be done at a hot temperature. And you can turn a loaf out in like 2 hours at rapid rise.
Okay.
And it'll taste like it turned it out in 2 hours. That's why you don't want it. Because by saying, oh, I can get to rise really fast, you're missing the fact that fermentation is developing flavor. You know?
And breaking down, you know, the phytic acid, I mean, the pre-digestion, there's loads of not just flavor but health benefits to
You basically,
breads.
the guy that wrote the book, food science book, McGee, I think is his last name, he apparently doesn't like whole wheat flour. And because of the fact that whole wheat flour, the minerals in the flour are bound up. If you don't ferment it, if you don't get phytase and amylase from the fermentation process, you don't get those minerals. Your body can't use them, right? He used that reason to say you should never buy, you don't have to buy whole wheat pasta because you don't get any benefit from it. He kind of forgot about the brand, but it's just his reason to not, use whole wheat flour was because the minerals aren't, it's true. I mean, unless they made the pasta with fermented flour, you're not going to be able to get those minerals. But if you're doing whole wheat bread, and even if you use yeast, if you just do it long and slow, you'll get those minerals. You get that nutrition. And of course, it'll taste way better, keep better. So you want to, the longer you can spread out your fermentation, the better. The longer you spread it out, the cooler you want it to be, unless you're going for sour flavor.
And I'm like, I have to jump on this because, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but there's all this like anti-wheat. I mean, I actually saw bumper stickers that wheat sucks at my daughter's school. I was like, really? And this whole everybody's gluten intolerant. Well, each tradition in baking, I mean, what I did with the Dazen, which was a Belgian Flemish tradition. In England, there's the Barm. In Italy, there's the Biga. In France, there's the Levain. I mean, each one was about this, slow fermentation, or even hominid corn was a breakdown of the corn, and all of this to deliver a more digestible grain. So when somebody says the modern wheats are evil because the gluten is crazy. It's not that the gluten is crazy in modern wheats. We're growing modern wheats worldwide, and gluten intolerance happens to be very much a first worldwide problem as far as I'm concerned. But how are we making our bread? And rapid rise and industrialized, milling and baking processes certainly are a problem and do lead to, I think, gluten intolerance.
I've helped some people who said they couldn't eat bread, and I said, I'll teach you how to make spelt. It takes more water, ferments faster, but you can learn to use it, and use a sourdough starter, long, slow fermentation. They're like, I can eat that bread, because spelt's got some easier gluten to digest anyways. If you get anaphylactic shock from gluten, you don't want to eat spelt.
And some people have a harder time with spelt because it digests real quick also in the culture too, it's easier to digest to a
It ferments really fast.
It ferments really fast.
Yeah.
So there's, the balance piece too.
You have to learn how to use it, yeah.
Yeah.
It's my favorite flour, I love it, but you have to.
I love kamut is my favorite.
See, I haven't used kamut, so then I guess I'm ready to
You can't grow it
become a
around
fickle
here.
lover.
Yeah, you can't grow it on here, but it's so
Those kinds of things will help you to, if you know people with digestion problems, then play with kamut or spelt and try and do the same fermentation. You can actually help them play with them anyways. I don't know, did you ever experience it? It's not that important, but I have to tell it. When you baked a lot of spelt, did it smell like there was apple pie spices in the bakery?
apple pie. It to me had more of like a nutty apple, like, I don't know. It definitely had a distinctly different. I was more challenged by the spelt personally because it was a different timing than our wheat. It was a different timing than the Glean. It was a different timing than the rye. It was just so fast, and
it is very fast.
To get it to not take off and to do a bakery where I finally just switched out and started feeding it with a kamut culture so that I could just change that piece and slow everything down because, yeah.
It would get out. Yeah, well, maybe because I was using yeast. Literally in our bakery, if somebody had me, they'd say, "Somebody make an apple pie." The whole bakery would smell like apple pie when you bake spelt. Probably not a loaf in your home thing, but a deck oven jammed full, 2 shelf, a shelf in each one. It actually makes that smell. It's very interesting stuff. I recommend playing with spelt and kamut, playing with those flours. Once you get into it, start with wheat probably, unless you have issues with it. But you'll be happy with it.
Rye.
Rye is probably I wouldn't start with rye probably. Yeah.
Well, but in cultures you could.
Yeah.
Like Groven wrote where your culture is cracked rye or a rye culture, but then you're using wheat. That's because it's a really great culture with flavor.
Basically the starters, if I'm not abusing them, I'm taking great care of them because I only use rye for starters. Rye is my favorite food for starters. And by the way, I don't know if you agree, but if you're like an artisan baker that's acing something, then probably having your starter fed on the grain you're going to use it with matters. But if somebody tells you, oh, you got a white starter, you can't make a whole wheat bread, bull. Just feed it with whole wheat before you make that bread. It'll work fine.
Yeah,
you can switch them out easily. You proof it, and the proofing, I'm really not going to try and tell you and that's what I ran into the most when I taught baking. I don't know if you ran into this too, but people were freaked that I wouldn't give them times. They wanted times. They wanted it on a clock. And indeed, my helper, Bob Strickland, he one time threw away this perfectly good dough. He didn't actually throw it away, but he put it to be thrown away, to go into the pile and I just took it and said, this is a great bread. I could tell you made a great loaf here. It had a persimmon starter, which sometimes can take forever. That starter, instead of being ready, as his book said, the book didn't know he was using persimmon starter, right? In 3 hours, it had to go overnight. I came down in the morning, I just had left it there, looked at it, it was gorgeous, I baked it. We had it on display when they did the display thing, I called it the Lazarus loaf. It was huge and golden brown, had a wonderful flavor. And he just couldn't handle it. It's like, but the book said 3 hours. It's like, you can't tell. It's not about the book, you're working with life. There's so many factors. So that's why we give you tools, how to give it a gentle push, how to tell that way. It's not about time, and I won't tell people times. And I tell you, when you look at a bakery book, you do not follow the times. You use the tools I give you to make a way better loaf, or the tools that Jen offers, than if you try to follow times,
Yeah, the best loaves, the turning point for my bakery was when I was finally like, I can't do these all-nighters anymore, and I opened the windows, I stoked the fire, and I opened the windows, and I went to sleep. And I came back in thinking I had thrown my whole bake, and it was like, oh my God, look, this is, the bread had risen overnight in cool temperatures. My oven suddenly had a deep, deep heat. Everything changed for me, and after that I put in a cool room and started doing long, slow ferments, but it was like, this is what it actually wanted, when trying to sort of distill it to, you know, just
follow a schedule, trying to make bread follow a schedule.
And then I shifted, okay, now this is my new schedule, and it was much more expanded, but for a work, if you're working and you're doing, I mean, it actually works well because you can feed your poultry, go to work, mix your dough next morning, you know.
Yeah, right. Okay, so basically that's what I'm going to talk about for this like quick little talk about bread. Final thing is the oven, okay? If you're trying to make artisan bread, the best thing is to have a wood-fired oven, but that's not that easy to come by. You can approximate it by having a pizza stone. There's also this fancy, expensive thing you can spend $300 on. I got one given to me by someone in my class because she built an oven, and it's that thick a slab, and it has sidewalls. I don't even bother to use the sidewalls. I don't see enough value from them. But if you use something that holds that massive bottom heat and slide your loaf onto that massive bottom heat, you're going to get way more interesting structure, way better rise, and just better bread. It takes planning though, because to heat that stone up, it's not like you turn the oven on and wait 15 minutes and start baking. You have to learn how long it takes to saturate that stone with heat. You know? And the more you can do that, I mean, I came from owning a bakery that had steel deck ovens. I didn't have any heat held at all. I then got a job at Earth Fair one winter when I was farming. I needed a job. And my boss was showing me how to slash the rolls, and they were way-proofed, and he slashed them, and they all collapsed, and I'm thinking to myself, you just wrecked those things, because in my oven, they were wrecked. They had this deck oven with a big stone and tons of, like, injected steam. Put those fallen loaves back in there, those rolls back in there, and poof, they popped up huge. You know, and that's what I mean. If you can, you know, ace the bake, if you can actually have enough heat and enough steam, you can fix something you messed up because you overproofed or something. You know, so having the best tools for everything, doing the best part of the way is what a baker, you know. So I recommend, if you're willing to do it, Diane hates it. She both wants the bread but doesn't want to be there when I bake it because she hates the smell that comes from an oven that's that hot. But frankly, you should put that stone in there and turn it to the highest temperature you can, you know. And I one time had a challenge from my boss to make a loaf that reminded him of Alice Waters' restaurant out in California. What's the name of that place?
Chez Panisse?
Yeah, Chez Panisse. We were eating there, and he said, "Today you can make this bread." You know, I said, "What?" He said, "Oh, you'll see." So I made a bread that reminded him of that, and I got a great big bonus. You know, here's bread for the bread I got for Christmas. You know, but I had to replace the element in my oven. Totally fried that up because I was just baking at 550 lots of times, putting tons of steam in there, and that's really a mean thing to do to an electric oven, you know. And by the way, if you're playing with steam, be very careful. If you hit glass or a light bulb, you'll break it. You ruin your bread, you know, you might have other problems too. The safest thing to do, though I'm a cowboy, I like to actually have a spray bottle and really get that steam going in a home oven. But the safest thing to do is and I actually have cast iron pan that I bought, the rustiest, nastiest cast iron pan I could find in the Goodwill, right? Keep it just for bread. And I just put that in the bottom of the oven when I'm turning the oven on, so it's loaded with heat too, and then I just throw ice cubes in there. And that'll give you a good, steady steam that'll last that 10, 15 minutes you want. You know? But because I want to ace it, I still open it up and spray. I know not to hit the glass, you know. And if you're going to do that, by the way, the best spray bottle is those pump-up ones. You don't have to think about pumping. You can just go steady and then tighten it down so it's a super fine mist. And you can get some really good steam that way. Basically, that's it, except for the critical thing. Remember to turn the oven down, right, after you've loaded the heat in there, or you'll burn your bread probably. So that's basically all those kinds of parts. I'm just going to give you demonstrations now. What I figured out, Tom and I figured it out together. Tom was my mixer and co-baker, and we learned that the wetter we could make the dough, the better it was. I mean, the first time we made a really wet loaf, we thought, oh boy, we messed that up, but we can't stop, we gotta go. And it was the best potato bread we ever made. And our potato bread, people, I mean, Roger DeRoe, who started at the first Earth Fair, he insisted we were putting cheese in it, you know, because it was just so, the texture was so satiny, and it's just a mouthfeel. Everybody said the best toast they ever had. And it's just because potato bread loves moist. I mean, the wetter we made it, I mean, literally, what happened to us in our bakeries, we got, I say our bakeries, it's just about Tom's bakery, he put his body and heart and soul into it too. We would get our technique better and better, and then we'd have the disaster of our bread didn't fit in our bags. You know, that ever happened to you? Literally, we'd have to order another size. I finally just bought the biggest bags I could get, so sometimes I would just be like a size another bag. We just got better and better, and the loaves got bigger and bigger. And the bulk of that, I'd say, was getting the absorption better and better, don't you think?
I think so.
Yeah, yeah. It was kind of fun, though. It's terrible not to be able to get the It's not what you plan on. Okay, did I bring that scraper down? I guess I'll do it without it. I recommend you use a scraper for this. I can get away with it but what I did was just put a little flour on top, and then I flip it. So the flour's now on the bottom, and it's going to allow me, it's basically a dough conditioning agent now. I'm no longer needing to add flour for the dough structure. I just need it to allow me to knead. So by putting that flour on there, I can now knead. It still sticks a little bit, right? But okay, so it's sticking too much. Now I'm going to add even less flour. And I always put it on top. Make sure it's all over so it won't stick. Quickly flip it. And now I can knead it for a little while. But it's going to get sticky right away because I'm making this is a focaccia. It's going to go into an 800-degree oven. I want a lot of water in there. You know, it's going to be really sticky. And I'm not really getting into it now when I'm actually teaching this like at the John C. Campbell. I like teach them a special technique to get the least amount of flour on there so that I can knead it without having to use very much flour at all. Once I've got the absorption I want. You know. This one, not as much because I'm going to let time do some of the work too. Time's already done some of the work. I kind of needed it for a few moments up there. But in a moment I'll be able to show you what I mean about how quickly it bounces back. And at this point, you know, and the reason, does everybody understand why I'm putting the flour on top and then flipping it? Okay. Because I'm going to fold it, right? I'm going to fold the wet part onto the wet part, and I've all of a sudden exposed the flour part. Does that make sense? So I keep the flour on the outside where it helps me knead, and I allow the dough to be nice and wet on the inside. It's as simple as that. So you flour it lightly on top, pat it around so the flour is evenly distributed, flip it, and I recommend, I'll find it at the moment, I think it's in that blue bag over there. Anyway, once I floured it, I fold it over, flip it, turn the bowl, fold it over, flip it. And by the way, partly because I have a hard time containing messes, I'm a great mess generator, I do all my kneading in one bowl. It never goes on the table. It's just that way I don't have to clean a table. I can spin it all the time. I'm sure I'm getting a good rotation on it. You know?
The other thing you're doing is you keep one hand clean, which is.
Yeah.
And do you know this tool?
No.
See, this was my favorite tool in bakery, and if you're using wet doughs, like I just, you can't use it in a bowl method. You have to use it on the table. The white is for, but
see, I flip with this too. Yeah.
What?
I flip it with this.
Yeah, like just using a tool, and whatever tool, I mean, it just depends on the baker and the scene, but...
If I was making ciabatta, I wouldn't dare try to flip it with my hand. I'd use this, This I can do it because I've done it long enough. You'll get sticky, you'll freak out about it. The other thing, this is a classic. Have you ever taught bread and they keep kneading without adding flour, and they say the dough keeps getting wetter and wetter. I said, no, you're making it stickier and stickier by tearing it, So you don't want to tear your dough. Think of it as an organism. Every time you tear it, you're wrecking gluten. So you take every action you can not to tear it. Yeah.
And that's why I was a real wet dough baker and high hydrations, and my methods were I would keep my hands wet, but not soaking, just wet enough that it wasn't sticking, and I used my scraper. But if it starts sticking, it would be like, I've got to wash my hands and start. So you either have the choice of throwing flour in as you're doing it in a very light way, or water.
When I'm teaching, if I was having you all do that now, I'd make sure you kept your hands clean all the time. I had to oil your hands. You'd also use water, but some way that sticking it's making the dough go in the opposite direction you want. If it starts to stick, you stop and figure out one of the techniques we just mentioned so it doesn't stick. So now, see, it's a lot easier to flip it. Okay. Now, quickly push it real hard with your fingers. Just give it a quick push. See how quick it comes back? Everybody get to see that? Okay, I can show you again if you didn't get to see it, but I have to actually knead it again because you'll get a false read that quickly. It won't come back as quick and you'll think, oh, it's not quite developed. Actually, it's just because it's already started to relax. So, and people would like stop and call me over and say, is it ready? I'd say, well, I can't tell you, you gotta knead it again. It took me 30 seconds to get here. It's gonna give you a false read. So, quick knead, be ready to give it a push. Go ahead. See how, you can hardly see that it came back. That's so ready. It doesn't need any more knead. I won't want to knead this more because it's a focaccia. I want it to be able to spread out. And it's not going to very much time anyways. I have to work at it, And do you find that the smaller the piece, the better it relaxes?
Oh, I don't know how to answer because it was always a really big. I'm more challenged by doing a small amount because I was a commercial baker. I find that baking in the house with 2 loaves, because there's so much benefit you get from a 20 or 40 pound dough in terms of volume. But I did do small focaccias and large focaccias, and yeah, I don't know. I also would just like roll them and cool them before they were baked. So there's.
Okay. Yeah.
There's the bottom line is there's like 100 ways to skin the cat.
Yeah.
And
I find for something like this, which I know is going to be really hard to shape, it's going to keep springing back when I try and make the focaccia because it's not going to get very much time to ferment. It was an afterthought. I realized I don't want to temper that oven. I don't want to just put loaves in an 800-degree oven. I want something. At John C. Campbell, where I taught, I'd look for all the wasted bread, all the wasted dough, and I'd put a glob together. I call it sacrificial lamb. I'd throw it in there and just like pull that really hot, flashy heat off the oven before I tried to put bread in there.
we always did pita with Alan Scott. The pita was the young dough. It was before everything else was fermented, and it was when the oven was too hot to put bread in, but hot. We'd already pulled we cleaned the hearth already, but it was too hot to bake with, and the pita was amazing. Just pocket it, flip it, pull it, and that was the temperature you needed for pita, and
a ciabatta would work that way too. A really sopping wet one that'll just. And actually, I went at John C. Campbell one time. I stayed up with this woman, Mary Dashiell. She's a really pretty good potter. She wanted to get the ciabatta to work right. And her and my assistant Bob and I sat around. We were drinking wine, so it wasn't too bad. Till 3 in the morning when she finally had her ciabatta ready. And she had this really wet dough. She folded it perfectly, put them in there like this big, and they popped like that. It's just so much fun to see. But I sat there looking at it. She made 4. For all that time, it's like, why didn't you make more? You're going to stay up till 3 in the morning. I don't ever. I actually did this because I was in a hurry to get back down here before I wanted to get down before Mark finished. But I never make one recipe. If I'm going to make a mess and all that, I at least double a recipe. It's just not worth my time to make a mess for 2 loaves of bread. Okay, so that's that. Now I'm going to go to probably not. I think I'm actually going to make the loaf that because I think I blew it and forgot to bring the remaining whole wheat flour down. This is okay, but I love this. Is exactly where I want it. So from Ed Raspy Brown, who's one of my favorite writers about baking. He just writes really wonderfully to me. He's a really great writer. And he instructs you to let this start to go until it's rolling and bubbling and incredibly powerful, right? I say let it go till it has fish eyes. And stop it there. Because I'm using yeast. I don't want the leavening from this. It'll go crazy. It'll be more sour than I want. I want a more subtle combination of the flavors. I want the dough conditioning. There's all kinds of other conditioning that happens from the sourdough starter. So I wait for what I call fish eyes. As soon as I have fish eyes, it's time to make the bread. And if I do that, it's more powerful. It rises even more powerfully than if I were to wait and let it get really strong. So, really interesting. That's it, learning to play with, I do have that flour. I do, great. Okay, let's do this one. Excellent. So I just have to look and see how much salt. I highly recommend, if you're not weighing, which I know Jen only would weigh, and I grew up as a baker in a time when weighing wasn't even thought of. So I just, and so I don't maintain scales. If I got a scale, I'll do it that way. But I don't like to be tied to the technology of the scales. Right now I have a really good scale, but it's got a funky plug. It's not, it's not staying on. But if you're not weighing, then you really need, to use table salt. Do not use kosher salt, do not use pickling salt, because that will throw you off. And the thing that matters most in measuring with bread, the critical thing, is salt. If you get that wrong, boy, the difference, you'll really see it. Next, it's water. Water is just about as critical. But if I fudge the water a little bit, I can get some forgiveness, by just working with the feel. If I don't have enough salt, the gluten will not have the strength it needs. If I have too much salt, the fermentation won't happen and it'll taste like crap. So the salt is critical.
And and you're so right. When Scott and I taught that class at John C. Campbell, that was when we all, wow, we need to check the sodium, because the sodium on Celtic salt, which I knew was lower than most salt, but we had a few different salts there and we compared, because not all salt is the same, unless you say stick with one type. And with, I worked in Baker's Percentage, so I worked with Celtic salt, so I would be like 2.25% would be my salt, whereas most bakers would be 2, but because I was lower in sodium, I was going to increase my salt. So, but it's that sodium piece that is the
salt being wrong, and indeed, have you ever forgotten what the salt is?
every baker.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know before you taste it, because the thing's just tearing up on top.
And this is why all bakers should be humble, because we've all forgotten the salt,
All forgotten it. And indeed, I had one baker who always forget the salt from the farmer's punch. I don't know why. I would have to stay up at night and fix it, And it wasn't Tom, by the way. I'm sure you forgot the salt once, but it wasn't. Your successor just couldn't, somehow. I think it's because it was the last other night and she was worn out. That's probably what it was. It cost me dearly, Okay, so I've got the salt in there. It already has all the right amount of water and stuff. We're going to use Jen's flour. Do you want to talk about the New York Warthog hard wheat?
It's a hard red wheat grown by my friend Tor Ochner up in the Ithaca area, because it's a single variety. Because we had run out of bread wheat from our farm down here. I don't know what to say about it. Well, I do know that it was, by the numbers, ridiculously low protein, but has performed for everyone and was a testament to a good soil. It used to be that you, as a baker, would find out the protein in the flour, and that was key. And then the realization that you could have high protein, low quality flour, or low protein, high quality flour, and that the protein number really became less relevant. What's really relevant is the quality. So.
And see, I only use quality flours, and I eventually decided I don't need to worry about the protein at all. But it's because I only use good flour.
Right. Well, when you're working with the farmer, that's when it matters, because you're needing to know,
Also,
what you're.
A word about the texture of this flour.
Nice.
So you think that's a good grind?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, cool.
It's a little sandy, but it's lovely.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was your bill. He's the miller,
Yeah, you can blame me if it's not.
No, it's
Totally.
it's different than our, because it's just small, but it's awesome.
So see, the other thing is, I actually recommend that once you've added the salt to your original fermentation, this is a sponge or whatever, once you've decided, right, that you have enough flour to get a dough where you want it, I don't worry about cups of flour that go into the dough. It's all by feel, And that's, somebody probably have in your classes, so many people would wreck their first dough because they say, but the book said this much flour. And they put all the flour in, and I come by and say, well, you got a brick,
Right, we don't work with recipes,
Yeah.
we work with formulas.
Yeah, it's all by feel. You just,
And like that flour, which is a little bit, it's a little sandy. It's gonna absorb
slowly.
as it's in there. Yeah. So you would want to kind of mix it wetter.
Mm-hmm. And that's another trick. If you're working with whole wheat flour, until you get used to it, it's a really good trick to get what you think is probably close to the amount of flour in there, but really quite wet, and walk away for a while. Give it 20 minutes or something, half an hour. Then you'll come back, and all of a sudden, what seemed like a really wet dough won't be wet anymore. Because the whole wheat, the bran, and the germs slow the absorption. So you just have to give it more time. Anyway, I've got it to where I can kind of show you the kneading. I'm going to make a quick rough thing, and then we're going to head out. And then I'm going to come back as soon as I think these are ready, which is probably about a half an hour. And then I'll do them, and then come back to join you for the end of it. So see, If you're trying to get started kneading and you can't handle it, you just use this instead, that's all. And by the way, folks, I want you to know that this will be the first loaf we bake, because it was the first one we made besides the focaccia, but also because the person I'm making it for said make sure you burn it a little. And that's always good to find. If you bake for a bunch of people, seek out that person that likes it burnt a little. You know? Did you have customers that wanted burnt bread?
I found that there was more people that didn't, and
Oh, by
that
far,
we,
yeah.
you know, and so you want to push the envelope and caramelize your crust, and people say it's burnt, and it's not burnt, it's
Yep.
caramelized,
Yep.
and the whole.
Indeed, it's hard to make a great artisan loaf and not have it be pretty darn dark on the bottom. You know,
Yeah.
if you're going to get the top to look good, the bottom's going to be pretty dark. So see, I'm just really light touch, not much flour. It's not really there, but you know what? So I'll do that. I'm going to show you. I need it one more time and show you the difference how it's not really there. But I know that when I walk away, by the time I come back, it's going to be there. I don't really need to do the kneading. I've got it close. So one last knead. See, I can't really, my hands are too sticky here. See, not coming back quite as fast, you know, and that's okay, because it can just sit here, and by the time I come back, I'll knead it once, and it'll be coming back fast as all heck, because it's going to be developing all the time that we're gone. Okay, that's the quick bread lesson. You got anything to add?
I think so.
Okay, cool.
This is amazing.
Let's go out to the field.